Neurosenodine Canada 1. Imagine drifting back in time, not to the lavish courts or towering castles of history books, but to the narrow, grimy alleys behind them, the smoke-choked streets, the foul-smelling water, the ceaseless noise of markets, bells, and boots on muddy stones. Tonight, we're not visiting the glamorous legends of the Middle Ages. We're venturing into the worst places to live during that era, the towns and cities where life was less romantic and more rotten. The kinds of places where survival was a daily miracle, and misery was as common as the rain. Let's begin in the heart of medieval Europe's urban chaos, the towns that grew too fast, too chaotically, and too carelessly. These were not the carefully planned cities of modern times. They were crowded hives of wooden houses leaning over crooked streets, with no sewage systems, no running water, and almost no rules. Human waste was dumped into the alleys. Chamber pots were emptied from second-floor windows. The smell clung to everything. Rats flourished. So did fleas. So did disease. These were places of relentless noise. Carts rattled over cobblestones. Butchers shouted. Vendors screamed prices. Bells rang for mass, for curfew, for fire, for plague. Smoke from thousands of chimneys painted the air grey. The wealthy had glass windows, but most people lived behind oiled cloth or bare shutters. Daylight barely reached the interiors. In winter, the air inside was choking with smoke. In summer, it stank of sweat and rot, and yet people crowded in. Why? Because the countryside was no better. At least in the town, you had the chance to find work. A blacksmith's forge, a baker's oven, a carpenter's bench, maybe a market stall of your own one day. For peasants fleeing failed crops or cruel lords, the city offered opportunity, however slim. But with it came danger. Fires swept through these timber cities regularly. One overturned lamp, one careless cook, and entire districts vanished in flame. Water came from wells, often shared by dozens of families, and often contaminated. People drank ale more than water, not for the taste, but for safety. And food, it was unpredictable at best. Bread might be filled with bark or ground bone to make it go further. Meat was expensive and often rotting. Milk soured quickly. Vegetables, if they appeared at all, were overboiled into mush. And then there was disease, plague, dysentery, leprosy, smallpox. Illness spread like wildfire in towns where people lived packed together, where pigs roamed freely, and where garbage festered in the gutters. Doctors, such as they were, offered bloodletting, charms, and prayers. Some wore bird-like masks filled with herbs, thinking this might ward off the invisible miasma. It didn't. Life expectancy in such places was brutal. Children rarely made it past 5. Women died in childbirth. Men fell from scaffolding or were crushed by carts. Old age was a rarity. If you lived to see 40, you were considered lucky. And yet, these towns pulsed with life. Beneath the grime and the noise, there was rhythm. People gathered in taverns to drink and sing. Guilds formed, groups of workers who protected their trade, and sometimes each other. Festivals were held. Bells tolled not just for death, but for marriage, for victory, for saints' days. Hope was not absent, just worn thin. And then there were the prisons, filthy, damp, overcrowded. You could be jailed for debt, for blasphemy, for stealing a loaf of bread. Torture was not uncommon. Trials were often public spectacles. Justice was swift and mercy rare. To be poor in a medieval town was to be always vulnerable. Vulnerable to sickness, to fire, to violence, to fate. You relied on neighbors and luck, on superstition and scraps, but still, people stayed. Because if you were lucky enough to find a roof and a warm meal, a bit of coin in your pocket, and a few friendly faces, you had something to protect, something worth singing about in the dark. So tonight, as we explore the worst places to live in medieval times, let's not do so with mockery. Let's walk these streets gently. Let's listen to the echoes of those who lived and worked and died in these impossible places, because even the hardest lives held laughter. Even the darkest alleys echoed with song. No 7 Chope, 3, 2. Our next destination takes us far from the suffocating city streets and into the wind-swept borderlands where war was a way of life, and peace was little more than a rumor. Here, we meet Aldrich, a man forged in blood and sorrow. A grizzled mercenary who'd long since lost the luxury of sentiment, Aldrich made his living on the knife's edge between 2 rival kingdoms, whose shifting borders meant endless skirmishes, looted villages, and ash where homes used to stand. Aldrich wasn't born into war, but he was born into its shadow. His father, once a humble farmer, was conscripted when Aldrich was still small. The family's life turned from plowshares to sword hilts overnight. By age 10, Aldrich knew how to track, how to aim a bow, and how to sleep with his boots on. His mother prayed daily for peace, but her whispered hopes were no match for fire and steel. One night, everything changed. A raid swept through their village, no warning, no mercy. Screaming neighbors, smoke rolling through the trees, Aldrich barely escaped the flames, dragging a half-conscious sibling behind him. His parents weren't so lucky. Clutching his dying father in the mud, Aldrich swore vengeance, not just against the raiders, but against the entire world that allowed such chaos to rule. Years passed. The boy became a soldier. The soldier became a killer. He didn't fight for justice or for flags, he fought for silver. Whatever warlord paid best, Aldrich would serve. He became known for his brutal efficiency, his unshakable calm amid carnage. He could gut a man and keep eating supper with the same hands. His name was both curse and warning on blood-soaked frontiers, but the violence changed him. Every victory chipped away another piece of his soul. The songs of youth fell silent. The warmth of friendship faded. He'd seen too many comrades bleed out in the dirt, their names forgotten before their bodies turned cold. He stopped remembering them, stopped caring. His blade grew heavier not from rust, but from memory. Eventually, an injury ended his fighting days. A deep cut to his sword arm never healed right. He could no longer lift his weapon with precision. So, with a sack of stolen coin and a 1,000-yard stare, Aldrich vanished from the battlefield. He reappeared years later in a crumbling stone tower, perched like a crow's nest above a valley long since emptied by war. The only signs of life were the weeds, the wind, and the broken walls of villages once full of song. Here he stayed, surrounded by ghosts and the distant clang of history. He kept no pets, no visitors, no fire in the hearth, just old scars and older regrets. He would sit for hours staring out across the land that had once burned his home to ash, that had turned him into what he'd become. Was it worth it? All the killing, all the coin? He didn't know anymore. In his mind, the past was not a timeline. It was a weight, one he could never set down. Sometimes, on stormy nights, he would drink cheap wine and talk to no one in particular, muttering about battles no one remembered, names no one repeated, wars no one had won, because in the end, no one ever did. The land changed hands a dozen times. Petty kings claimed it, then lost it. Fortresses rose and crumbled. The only victors were rot, rust, and silence. Aldrich had survived, but survival, he'd come to learn, wasn't the same as living. Somewhere out there, he knew, another boy was clutching another dying father. Another village was burning. The wheel turned, and it would keep turning long after he was gone. Thus, in the lonely quiet of a ruined tower, one old soldier waited for the world to forget him. Not with fear, not with pride, just with the dull acceptance of someone who had seen too much and been changed by all of it. His tale is not heroic, but it is real, and in its way it is more enduring than the stories of kings. We now turn our gaze to the sodden trenches of a medieval siege, where damp earth, disease, and despair conspire to break even the strongest men. Meet Ivo, a veteran soldier whose youth had long since been buried beneath mud and blood. For decades he had sold his sword to various warlords and princes, each promising honor, coin, or some vague form of glory, but all Ivo found was suffering. By the time he joined the siege, he was already a hardened soul, his armor mismatched, his beard streaked with grey, his eyes dulled from years of watching comrades perish in ditches. The latest conflict had brought him to the outskirts of a small but stubbornly defended castle. The army had expected a quick victory, march in, intimidate the defenders, and claim the spoils. Instead, they met resistance. The castle's garrison refused to yield. Behind their high stone walls, they hurled insults, arrows, and boiling oil. What was supposed to be a show of force turned into a siege that dragged on for weeks, then months. The summer heat baked the tents by day and turned the latrines into foul pits. By night, the damp crept in, rotting boots, bedding, and flesh alike. Soon the camp was a breeding ground for sickness. First came the fevers, then the coughs, then the swellings. Ivo watched healthy men collapse mid-sentence. Their eyes clouded over as their bodies bloated and blackened. The camp's physicians did what they could. Leeches, poultices, prayers, but none of it helped. The grave pits grew deeper. There was no real rest. The enemy launched nighttime raids through hidden tunnels. Fires spread from flaming arrows shot over the ramparts. Sleep was interrupted by screams, smoke, and the sickening thud of blade against flesh. Ivo once woke to find the man beside him gutted, his entrails glistening in the firelight. Even seasoned soldiers began to mutter about desertion. Their commander, a plumed noble with soft hands, watched from his luxurious tent far from the front lines. He issued commands, held feasts, and scolded those who dared complain. Morale rotted faster than the salted meat. Ivo didn't talk much anymore. Words seemed useless. His only goal was to live through the day. Each morning he ran a mental count of limbs, 2 arms, 2 legs, still breathing. Good enough. He rationed his stale bread and watered-down ale like treasure. The rest of his time was spent avoiding arrows and trying not to step in anything that squelched. There were moments of grim humor, of course. Soldiers cracking jokes about their own decay, gambling with lice-ridden dice, singing off-key songs to drown out the death groans. But laughter in the trenches was a defiant kind, desperate, hollow, cracked like Ivo's lips. Food became a distant memory. Supplies dwindled. Rats grew fat while men withered. Ivo once watched a squad roast a dog they found half alive near the edge of camp. No one questioned it. Hunger had long since silenced judgment. Rain fell without mercy. It turned the ground into sludge and soaked through every layer of cloth. Ivo's blanket was more mold than wool. He curled up in it anyway, shivering, trying to pretend he didn't hear the dying moan of some boy too young to hold a sword. And still the siege continued. The castle didn't fall, neither did the soldiers. They simply rotted, slowly, like meat left out too long. Eventually, a peace treaty was signed by men who had never set foot in the trenches. The armies withdrew, and the survivors limped home, what few of them remained. Ivo didn't celebrate. He just packed up what little he had and walked away from the camp without looking back. His reward? A handful of silver coins and a new cough that never quite went away. For Ivo and others like him, siege warfare wasn't a chapter in a history book. It was a long, slow descent into hell. It stripped men of dignity, of hope, of humanity. The only equalizer was death. It came for nobles and footmen alike, dressed in hunger, disease, and quiet despair. And if Ivo found any comfort at all, it was knowing that on both sides of the wall, the suffering had been the same. There were no heroes, just survivors and ghosts. December 3 let us now sail far beyond the muddy battlefields and crumbling castles of Europe, across the churning grey seas, to the edge of the known medieval world. Here, in the damp, treacherous outposts of early colonization, we meet John, a hopeful young man who had once imagined a grand adventure. His was a dream forged in the smoky alleys of London, where tales of new lands glittered brighter than the dull coins in his pocket. The third son of a struggling baker, John had few prospects, no inheritance, no apprenticeship, just calloused hands and a restless spirit. So when whispers of a voyage to uncharted shores reached his ears, of fertile soil, untapped riches, and second chances, he leapt at it. He pawned what little he owned, lied about his age, and boarded a creaking, overcrowded ship bound for a colony he couldn't even pronounce. The journey itself was a torment. Cramped quarters below deck stank of sweat, sickness, and spoiled food. Rats scurried freely. Fresh water was rationed. Salted meat turned green in the barrels. People died quietly in the night and were dumped overboard at dawn. John clung to his hope like a talisman, whispering to himself that it would all be worth it once they arrived. But arrival brought no salvation. The settlement was little more than a clearing hacked out of dense forest, surrounded by a crude palisade. The air was thick with biting insects. The soil, they discovered, was poor. The promised riches were nowhere to be found. Disease spread before foundations were finished. Malaria, dysentery, scurvy. The colonists had no real doctors, only a few old wives' remedies and desperate prayers. John worked from dawn to dusk, clearing brush, hauling timber, digging ditches. His hands blistered, his skin cracked and bled. At night he collapsed onto a mouldy bed of straw inside a communal hut, listening to the coughing and crying of men and women who were fast losing their minds to hunger and fever. Supplies from the homeland were delayed or diverted. The governor barked orders while hoarding rations in his fortified cabin. Then came winter. The cold seeped through every wall and blanket. The river froze. Hunting parties returned empty-handed. Some men spoke of mutiny. Others disappeared into the woods, never to return. Rumors of cannibalism began to spread, not loudly but with the hush of fear. John tried not to believe them, but when his neighbor's body was discovered missing more than limbs, belief became unnecessary. Even worse, tensions with the native tribes turned deadly. What had begun as wary trade turned into bitter conflict. A misinterpreted gesture, a stolen tool, a false promise, and blood was spilled. Retaliation followed. Arrows flew, huts burned, ambushes struck without warning. John learned to sleep with one hand on a dull hatchet and to run at the sound of rustling leaves. His dream of a better life turned into a daily struggle for breath. One night he wandered beyond the palisade, unable to bear the smell of death inside the camp. He found himself by the frozen river, staring at the moonlight glittering on the ice. For a moment he imagined his mother's kitchen. Warm bread, laughter, the sound of rain on the roof. A world lost, a life he had traded for this frozen hell. By spring the colony had shrunk to half its size. Some had fled, many had died. John remained, not out of courage, but because he had nowhere else to go. He was gaunt, pale, his clothes threadbare, his eyes sunken with quiet despair. And still, he worked, because some part of him refused to lie down and die. He planted seeds in stony ground. He taught himself to fish. He mended walls and shared bread crusts with those weaker than himself. He became something more than the foolish boy who had boarded that ship. He became a survivor. His story was not glorious. He would never be knighted, never own land, never return home. But in a world where hope died easily, John held on to it with bleeding hands, and that perhaps was enough. So 702.3.05. Our journey now leads us to a place far removed from war and famine, but no less steeped in suffering. A remote monastery clinging to the cliffs, like a barnacle on the edge of the world. Here we meet Brother Adelmo, a man of 70 winters whose entire adult life had been lived behind thick stone walls, cloaked in silence and ritual. Once a scribe, now a ghost among the living, Adelmo embodied the kind of devotion that could harden into exile. The monastery was not a haven of peace, as outsiders sometimes imagined. It was a fortress of austerity. Its draughty corridors echoed with chants, not laughter. The gardens yielded little. The bread was hard, the broth thin, and the air heavy with incense and mildew. Brother Adelmo's world was ink-stained fingers, cramped posture, and the eternal scratching of quill on parchment. He copied books for decades, not to understand them, but to preserve them. The meaning mattered less than the form. His cell was barely larger than a coffin. A straw mattress, a crucifix, a single candle. The wind howled constantly through the cracks. Winter brought frost to the inside of the walls. Summer brought flies. There was no fire. Heat was indulgence, so were conversation, laughter, or even eye contact. Each day began before sunrise with a bell, not a joyous chime, but a call to submission. Vigils, lauds, prime, terce, sext. None missed without punishment. Meals were taken in silence. Breathing too loud could draw a glance. Coughing during mass could mean days of solitary penance. Some monks muttered prayers even in their sleep. So deeply had the ritual seeped into their bones. Adelmo had once come to the monastery seeking peace, after his family perished in a village fire. He was young then, grieving, desperate. The abbot had welcomed him with measured words and a bowl of lentils. Adelmo had cried through his first vespers, but years dulled even pain. His tears dried, his voice fell silent, his identity dissolved into the habits of the cloister. He became known for his precision. Each letter he wrote was flawless, each line straight, but his eyes dimmed, his back hunched, and his fingers twisted with age. The books he copied grew blurred. The younger monks surpassed him. He did not mind. His purpose was not to shine, but to serve. At night he sometimes sat alone in the chapel, surrounded by flickering candles and the gaze of wooden saints. He did not speak. He did not pray. He merely listened, to the silence, to the creak of beams, to the gentle drip of rain leaking through the ceiling. He had long ago stopped expecting answers. Outside, storms battered the cliffs. Visitors were rare. Most who came did not stay. The discipline was too harsh, the comforts too few. But Brother Adelmo endured, not because he believed in reward, but because the monastery had become the only world he knew. The cold stone, the dry bread, the endless hours of labor. They were home. And yet, now and then, when a breeze blew through the scriptorium just right, carrying the scent of sea salt and wildflowers, Adelmo would pause. For a moment he would remember a different life. The smell of bread from his mother's oven, the warmth of a sister's hand, the sound of rain on a wooden roof. He would blink, and the moment would pass. Once, a visiting scholar asked him, "Are you happy here, brother?" Adelmo had stared at the man for a long time before answering, "I no longer know the word." He wasn't bitter, just tired. In his final years, his eyesight all but gone, Adelmo was assigned to simple tasks, binding pages, cleaning ink pots, sweeping corridors. He did them without complaint. When he died, no one cried. The monks dug a shallow grave and buried him with a plain wooden cross. No eulogy, no song. But one of the young scribes found his final manuscript, a copy of the Psalms, its letters elegant despite fading ink, and placed it gently on the highest shelf of the library. "Let the words remember him," he whispered, and so they did. Nuersen 306. Let us descend now into the cold, stifling belly of a castle keep, where the light of day rarely reaches, and the air is thick with mildew and misery. Here lives Elaine, a woman whose name would be forgotten by history. Had she not etched it, one fingertip at a time, into the damp stone wall of her cell? Elaine had once walked freely through the meadows of her village, her laughter carried on the wind like the scent of wild flowers. She was a healer, trained by her grandmother, and her hands had delivered babies and soothed fevers. But when the Lord's son fell ill and died despite her efforts, fingers pointed. Whispers of witchcraft grew louder than reason. The priest nodded. The bailiff came. Her screams echoed through the village square as she was bound and dragged away. Now her world was 6 feet of stone and shadow. Her cell was barely taller than she was. The floor was slick with moss and rat droppings. The only window was a slit no wider than her wrist, letting in just enough light to make the darkness visible. The guards tossed stale bread and tepid water through a hatch in the door. Sometimes they forgot. Sometimes they remembered too well. Elaine had stopped counting the days. Time didn't pass down here. It crawled. Her fingernails grew brittle. Her hair, once honey gold, now hung in greasy clumps. She wrapped her thin shift tighter around herself and waited. For what? She no longer knew. Interrogations were random. Sometimes they came for her with questions, other times with ropes and iron. Once they tried to drown her in a barrel to see if she would float, proof, they claimed, of sorcery. She survived. Barely. The pain was a constant hum beneath her skin, but worse than the wounds was the loneliness. The silence so loud it made her ears ring. She began talking to the stones. She gave the rats names, whispered prayers to cracks in the wall, and still she did not confess. Not because she hoped for justice, but because she would not let them own her voice. If she was to die, it would be as herself, not the monster they imagined. One day, a young scribe came to record her confession. He was barely more than a boy, with ink-stained fingers and nervous eyes. He sat across from her, pen trembling, and asked, "Why won't you just say what they want?" Elaine looked at him, steady and unblinking. "Because I am not what they want me to be." The boy said nothing, but his hand stopped shaking. Later she heard that he had left his post, vanished. Perhaps her words had planted something in him, a seed of defiance. Perhaps not, but it was the only time someone had looked at her and seen a person, not a verdict. The seasons turned above her. Snow fell, crops grew, children were born and old men died, but the dungeon remained unchanged, a tomb for the living. One morning, the guards opened her cell and dragged her out into the sun. The light stabbed her eyes, the crowd had gathered, the stake had been built. She did not scream. As the flames rose, she did not curse. She looked at the sky, at the clouds, at a single bird soaring overhead. Her body burned, but her gaze remained fixed, not defiant, not broken, simply free. Afterward, they scattered her ashes in the river, but the wall of her cell remained, and in its cold face, scratched by frail fingers, were the words, "I was here. I was not silent. They tried to erase her, but even the stones remembered." Nurasan 2.3.07. In the wake of Elaine's final stand, her name carved into damp stone, her spirit defiant even as flames consumed her, let us pause, not in silence but in solemn reflection. Her story, like so many we've explored, was not one of grand deeds or heroic victories. It was quieter, grimmer, and in many ways more honest, for history is not written only in crowns and crusades. It is etched into the fingernails of women shackled in darkness, in the backs of peasants bent beneath impossible burdens, in the hollowed eyes of monks and mercenaries who survived not for glory, but because they simply had no other choice. Elaine's fate was not rare. She was one among thousands who suffered in silence, punished not for crime, but for disobedience, for independence, for existing in a world ruled by the whims of those above her. Her story ends in a whisper, but it echoes, through time, through stone, through the voices of those who will never be recorded in royal annals or gilded chronicles. In honoring her, we honor them all. But our journey through hardship does not end in the dungeon. No, there are yet more corners of this medieval world to uncover. Corners not confined by stone, but by circumstances just as brutal. Places where the suffering was quieter, slower, but no less severe. Places like the homes of peasants, the hovels of widows, the siege tents of starving soldiers, and the wind-lashed towers where watchers stood guard through nights that never seemed to end. Each of these places, each of these lives, carried their own weight of despair. And yet, as with Elaine, there were flickers of something more, something stubborn and human that refused to be extinguished. Let us look now beyond the prison walls, to another figure huddled in the cold, William. He was not a nobleman, nor a criminal, just a servant, aging and aching, quietly fading behind castle walls. His story was not dramatic. There were no battles, no uprisings, no final defiance. And yet, in his quiet persistence, in every burn on his hand, every burden lifted without thanks, he bore witness to the same truth that Elaine showed in her final breath. Survival is a kind of rebellion. William had spent a lifetime in the shadow of power, fetching water for nights, scrubbing the soot from hearthstones, watching others rise and fall while he remained, always there, always overlooked. The castle was his cage, just as Elaine's dungeon had been hers, but where she resisted with fire, he endured with patience. He found meaning in moments so small they might be missed entirely. A shared loaf of bread, the warmth of a dog curled at his feet, the fleeting smile of a kitchen maid. And that, perhaps, is the other face of resilience, the kind that does not scream or scratch or burn, but simply continues, quietly, steadily, until the end. As William aged, his limbs stiffened and his tasks grew slower. The world outside changed, but his world, stone walls, cold floors, routine, remained, and still he stayed, not because he was trapped, but because, like many before him, he had grown to mistake familiarity for comfort, routine for safety, and perhaps, in a world as unpredictable as the medieval one, that illusion was enough. In his final days, lying on a straw-stuffed pallet and listening to the distant clatter of armor and bells, William thought not of kings or conquests, but of the warmth of firelight, the scent of baking bread, and the hands that once reached for his in fleeting kindness. He passed quietly, unmourned by nobles, unrecorded by scribes, but if we remember him now, even for a moment, then perhaps his life, too, mattered. It's easy to romanticize the past, to drape it in banners and heroism, but these stories remind us that the true weight of history rests not on the shoulders of the mighty, but on the backs of the forgotten, and there are more stories yet. Beyond the castle, beyond the village, on the crumbling edges of kingdoms, and beneath the cracked sky of siege camps, there are other souls waiting. A battle-weary foot soldier dozing in damp armor, a field worker watching smoke rise from the horizon, uncertain if her home still stands, a child peeking from behind a crumbling wall, too young to understand why everything feels broken, but old enough to feel afraid. We will meet them next, and in doing so, we will continue our journey, not just through suffering, but through what endures in its wake. Before we end this journey, there is still something more, something quieter, yet no less essential. We have wandered through dungeons and siege camps, kitchens and colonies. We've listened to whispered prayers, final breaths, and silence so thick it felt like another kind of weight. But now, let us pause in the soft twilight of reflection, not as historians, but as human beings. Elaine carved her name into stone. William faded behind castle walls. John looked for freedom and found frost. And yet, in all of them, in all the stories we've gathered along this path, there was a thread that held everything together, a refusal to vanish, a quiet insistence on meaning, even in places where meaning should not have survived. They endured hunger and cruelty, cold nights and colder hearts, but more than that, they endured forgetfulness, the way the world so often moves on without looking back. So tonight, we look back. We look not to glorify pain, nor to romanticize struggle, but to acknowledge it, to say, you were here, you mattered, even if no one told you at the time, even if history left your name in the dirt, even if your life ended in silence, we carry you now. Let us sit for a while with that thought. No rush, no urgency, just stillness, because the world you've just traveled through was not made of battles and banners. It was made of moments, of steam rising from bread, of cloth torn and mended, of calloused hands and tired smiles. It was made of people who loved and lost and tried again, and still beyond the prison walls and castle kitchens, beyond frost-bitten trenches and ink-stained chapels, there are more stories yet to be told. Not louder stories, just different ones. Stories of those whose suffering did not come from war, but from waiting. Not from chains, but from isolation. The kind of pain that does not leave scars on the skin, but on the soul. We turn next to them, to a place not marked on any map, a place where life moved slower, where winters were long, and where people learned to live with little and hope with less. In that place, a woman once lit a candle every night for a son who never came home. A child buried a note in the earth for a father lost to plague. A blind man sang into the wind, though no one ever clapped. These too are the worst places to live, not because of what they lacked, but because of how little they were seen, and how easily they were forgotten. But not tonight. Tonight we go to them with listening hearts and open hands. There was once a man known only as the singer. No one remembered his birth name, not even he. By the time he came to the village, blind and bent with age, people simply called him that, the singer. He carried a small harp slung over his shoulder, its strings worn, its wood polished by time and touch. He did not beg, he did not barter, he offered only stories, and in return he asked only for a place by the fire and a bowl of warm broth. He was not a bard in the courtly sense. No lord summoned him to recite lineage or praise the bloodlines of men who wore too much silver. He wandered between the forgotten places, ruined hamlets, storm-torn cottages, watchtowers where only ghosts kept guard. He went where no heralds walked, and in those quiet corners he sang. His songs were not pretty, they did not rhyme, and few could dance to them. They were rough things, scraped from memory, shaped by grief, weighted with dirt. He sang of women hanged for touching herbs, of children buried in frozen ground, of farmers who fought wolves with bare hands, of husbands who vanished into the woods and never returned. But he also sang of kindness, of the widow who fed strangers with her last grain, of the man who carried his wounded enemy to safety, of a brother who waited 30 years for forgiveness and found it in a single tear. No one asked how the singer knew these stories. Some claimed he was a monk gone mad. Others thought he was a spirit, a walking memory. The truth was simpler and more human. He had lived long, and he had listened. He listened when people thought no one cared, when the sobbing mother buried her daughter behind the chapel, when the boy by the river muttered secrets into the reeds, when the soldier whispered apologies to a tree he thought was his father's grave. The singer remembered it all, and he wove it into songs that outlasted the people who spoke them. In one village they tried to stone him, said he brought bad luck. In another they crowned him with flowers. He accepted both in silence. He slept under bridges, in barns, once in the nave of a church, curled beside a broken bell. He feared no man and no place except the cities. In the cities, no one listened. The noise drowned his notes. The people were too busy running from their own silence to hear someone else's. And so he walked and sang, even when his voice cracked, even when no one clapped, even when the only audience was the wind. They say the last time he was seen, he stood alone on a cliff edge at dusk, facing the sea. His harp hung silent, his mouth moved, but no one heard a sound. He stayed there until night swallowed him, and in the morning he was gone. Some say he died, others say he became the wind itself, carrying stories from one ear to the next. But one thing is certain. In every corner of the land, in every firelit room and crumbling chapel, fragments of his songs remained. In lullabies, in laments, in the way a child hums to themselves when they're scared. He sang for those no one remembered, and because of him, they were never truly forgotten. Or 702-310. So now, dear traveller, as your eyes grow heavier and your thoughts drift like mist over ancient fields, let us gather one last time in the soft hush of memory. You've walked through plague-stricken alleys and watched over frostbitten children. You've sat beside prisoners whose only crime was refusing to disappear. You've listened to a blind man sing of forgotten names, and you've stood at the edge of wars that ended in silence. Through it all, you've carried the thread of their stories. It humbles us, doesn't it, to realize how much hardship built the comforts we now take for granted. The soft mattress beneath you, the hum of safety in the walls, the stillness of a locked door. These are luxuries unknown to most of the people we've met. And yet, even without them, they dreamed. Even without protection, they resisted. Even in agony, they hoped. The past was not merely brutal, it was also brave. Perhaps when sleep proves elusive on some distant night, you'll think of John's shattered dreams, or Elaine's final spark of defiance. Perhaps you'll remember William quietly surviving, or the singer humming alone on a hill. And maybe, in remembering them, you'll find your breath steady, your heart softened, your own burdens just a little lighter. We do not revisit history to pity it. We return to it to understand, to hold hands across time and whisper, I see you, I hear you, you are not forgotten, and in that whisper there is healing. Tonight, as the darkness deepens and the sounds of our time fade to hush, take comfort in knowing this. You are not alone, not in your fears nor your fatigue. You rest now at the end of a long, strange journey, and you've earned this peace. The world you return to is imperfect, yes, but it is one shaped by the endurance of those who came before. Breathe in deeply. Let the warmth of your bed wrap around you like a tapestry of all the lives we remembered. Let your body loosen, your thoughts slow, your breath fall into rhythm with the stories you now carry. You are home, and you are safe. And somewhere in the soft stretch of dream, the singer hums your name. Good night, my fellow wanderer, until we meet again.